If I didn't say who I was, then who you say I am is going to be really painful for me. And I will not survive. I will live through life with a sense of brokenness, defect, unworthiness. And I will get to the end of my life not having lived the full breadth and depth of my life. So when I believed that being a Black woman meant a certain thing, anytime someone would reflect that back to me, I would feel hurt. But when who I know myself to be doesn't match up with who you're telling me I am, then it just bounces off. Before we go out and say, this is the way I'm going to go change the world, really, we deserve to get the healing, to reconnect to that source inside of ourselves that is loving, that feels worthy, that feels good. And that is very revolutionary because it's remaking the world.
Hello and welcome. Many of you know about Presence Collective, the online membership community I host, which offers a space to dive deeper into the themes of the podcast as you integrate them with the support of a community, wisdom, tools, and practices. If you'd like to be part of this, please come over and join us. Click on courses on our website, www.thefutureisbeautiful.co, and you can find out more. The well-being and sustainable lifestyle spaces are often very white. This has been the case for me in most of the trainings that I've done, most of the projects I've collaborated on, and the communities I've participated in. I've often found myself to be the only person of colour in a room. Most of my teachers, mentors, and colleagues have been and are white people. Sharing this isn't an anti-white sentiment by any means, but I have over the years come to really appreciate hanging out and collaborating more with other people of colour, to feel the support of allies and communities that experience some of the same subtle and not so subtle things as I do, and to be able to talk about it. I've found, just like when we started to talk more about Me Too, that the more we talk about white supremacy and white fragility, the more heavy lifting I have to do for the collective as what was unseen or unspoken about becomes more visible. For me, race and decolonization is a huge part of the work that I'm offering and the overall vision I see for both Presence Collective and The Future is Beautiful. It takes time, and it's interesting for me to notice that despite having a global community and Presence Collective being open to anyone from anywhere in the world, that there is a small percentage of people of colour. I would love for this to be a more representative space, and so I'm offering a discount to make it more possible for people of colour to join and to acknowledge the gift of your presence. Not in a quota-filling way, but because we can't build a beautiful future if we aren't representing a wider share of the collective, and if the healing isn't more inclusive. So if you are a person of colour, you can use the code representation when you join Presence Collective for 20% off the membership price. It's not really about the money, I know, but I want to offer this as a gesture to make you feel even more welcome. And because well-being and all of the themes that we talk about on this podcast affect all of us, and we need you to grow the conversation. Race and white supremacy is, of course, a huge issue that affects everything that we're part of, and is an important component of the politics that we have right now, and an election issue. For example, a survey shows 71% of people from ethnic minorities face discrimination, up from 58% since the Brexit vote in 2016 in the UK. The same survey showed that online racism and racism towards women has also increased. According to the Home Office, hate crimes have been rising each year since 2013. Looking at the USA, there are stats that show that Black men are far more likely to be shot and killed by the police than white men. People of colour earn less than white people, similar to the pay gap for women. And 2/3 of the people in prisons in the US are people of colour. And there are active hate groups in every state in the USA. What we're talking about today is something subtler that comes from the same system of oppression. I share this to give some perspective, as sometimes in the yoga world, for example, you hear people say things like, they don't see race. The collective human experience does though, and we are all part of that. And we have to go beyond any kind of spiritual bypassing to understand how this affects all of us. My guest today is Layla Saad, author of the groundbreaking book, Me and White Supremacy, and the host of Good Ancestor podcast. As a widely read writer, a globally sought speaker, and a popular podcast host, Layla is passionate about creating inspiration, education, and activation for personal and collective change in the world. Layla's work is driven by a powerful desire to become a good ancestor, to live and work in ways that leave a legacy of healing and liberation, especially for Black girls and Black women. Layla is unapologetically confronting to the oppressive systems of white supremacy and patriarchy, while offering important teachings and tools for transforming consciousness, cultivating personal anti-racism practice, and taking responsibility for our individual and collective healing. In this conversation, we explore the question, how does white supremacy show up in our lives, and what is our work to do? I hope that you enjoy this episode and that it opens up a pathway of healing for you and your ancestors. Welcome to The Future is Beautiful, with me, your host, Amisha Gadiali. On this show, we explore the weave between politics, spirituality, creativity, and sustainability. It's time for us to move beyond silos and into an integrated way of being. Every one of us has ideas and personal experiences to share that can lead us to a brighter future. This is the revolution. Despite the challenges we face as a global community or the pressures that we meet in our daily lives, when we stop and dare to dream, to ask ourselves the big questions, and to share what we are already doing, we create the future that we wish to wake up for. That future is beautiful. I am delighted to welcome you to The Future is Beautiful, Layla. Thank you for being here.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
When I came across your work, and I suppose it's part of a wave of women that I see articulating these issues and their own personal story in a way that I find really courageous, because in my own life, I guess the way that I was taught to relate to my race was to not draw attention to it.
Yeah.
It's been, I've been going through my own journey for a long time, at least a decade, but it's been somewhat a private journey of realizing that there are differences and that those differences affect one's life in profound ways. And yeah, I've just been really admiring the courage and then also noticing what it's been bringing up for me as I've seen women, and predominantly like you and some others on Instagram, that are really coming forth and sharing about this in an unapologetic yet compassionate and clear way. So thank you for doing that. And I would love to hear, I guess, that moment of when something that perhaps for you, and I don't know your whole story, was something that was unspeakable out loud, became something that had to be spoken out loud.
Well, thank you for acknowledging the way that I show up and many women of color and Black women show up in this work. As you were speaking, you said something that really, really resonated with me, which is the way that I was taught to relate to my race was not to draw attention to it. And that was definitely my conditioning as well. It's really interesting because I know right now I'm in a place publicly in the world where, I have this body of work that I'm putting out into the world, this Me and White Supremacy work that has gone super viral, is about to become a published book, has reached, almost 100,000 people, in many places is being used as a curriculum. But just a few years ago, I was completely in what you would call the matrix, right? Of white supremacy. And really, I was not fully aware of the ways in which I made myself small in spaces. I chose to not see what being a Black woman meant in the spaces that I was in, which comes from survival mode, being in survival mode and just doing what you need to do to get through, right? And so my way of being in the world, I have been in the personal growth and sort of wellness world now for about 6 years. And it was only 2 years ago that I realized, hey, how come I'm a Black woman and the majority of my clients are white? The majority of my audience are white. The majority, when I go into these, coaching programs and summits and things like that, where people who look like me are really the minority, both in the audience and on the panels, in the speaker seats. How come when it comes to who we see as people of credibility and expertise, the best-selling authors, the best-selling speakers, why are there so few people who are Black and brown? I had not noticed it. Subconsciously, it must have been there, but it was like I had been so used to this idea that just me being in those spaces was something that I should not take for granted. Why draw attention to the fact that I'm the only one? It was my normal for a really long time, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It was my normal for a really long time. It didn't strike me as odd because I had been so used to adjusting myself as someone who didn't really belong, but would try super hard to try to belong. And that was what I had grown up with as normal. But what began to happen is, as you said, there is this wave now of people who are using the technology of social media to be able to reach people with information, stories, and messages that have always been there. It's just now we're able to access them in a much different way. And so as I began to read and follow different people who were activists, who were teachers, I really began to reflect on how is this showing up in my life? And to my horror, what I was seeing was that although I am not a white woman, I am a Black woman, for all intents and purposes, I had built a business, I'd built a space for myself in which I was perpetuating white supremacy towards myself and therefore in the world as well, towards anyone else. I would wonder, how come I don't get more clients who are Black women? I know that I'm a Black woman and I'm interested in this work, right? So I can't be the only one, but why is it that they're not? It's not that they can't afford it. It's not that they're not interested. There must be something else. And what I saw was that the way that I was showing up really centered white women, really was a white feminist approach. And by white feminist, I mean a type of feminism that really focuses only on differences of gender and not on any other sources of identity. As I began to do the work to really investigate for myself, what does this mean? Why have I been showing up in this way? Why have I been doing this to myself? It was this really uncomfortable awakening of seeing just how much I was oppressing myself and setting things up for myself in a way where it was normal to be in a situation of marginalization. That work, though, was really personal. It wasn't something that I was writing about or talking about. It was things that I was sitting with and journaling on and seeing what changes do I need to make in my work. And I did that for a period of about a year. And I think, like with many people, a lot of this awakening did come with the 2016 US presidential election. But that, I'm really clear that is not the source of this. That is just, an event that has happened that is awakening many of us at the same time. But these issues have been there always. But it certainly is an event which for many of us really was an unveiling. As I began to sort of self-reflect, start to make changes in the way that I was showing up, there did come a moment, and that was your question, what was the moment? And the moment for me is very clear. It was very specific. I'd been doing this work internally with myself for a while. And then it must have been 2017, there were the marches that took place in Charlottesville with neo-Nazi men, holding torches. And it was a moment which was really, when I think about it now, I'm like, why did that affect me the way that it did? I don't live in the US, right? But I saw those images on the internet. And I saw in those men's eyes this absolute hate. And it was something that it had never confronted me in that kind of a way, that sort of making this connection between this thing that for myself from a very young age, that I have been taught that because you're a Black girl, because you're a Black woman, you will be treated as less than. You'll be treated as if you don't deserve to take up space. You will be treated as if you have to work twice as hard just to prove that you belong. That thing was directly connected to the hate that I saw in those men's eyes. Mm. Right. And so I describe it as the line that I always use to describe it is a line from Zora Neale Hurston's book, Their Eyes Were Watching God. And there's a line in there where she says, something fell off the shelf inside of her. And it was like that. It was like a switch was flipped inside of me, where the messages I had received as a child and the thing that I was seeing as an adult, the two things connected with each other. And I understood that who I was, what I looked like, the melanin in my skin causes a reaction like the one I was seeing of absolute vitriolic, violent hate. Something shifted inside of me where it was like it was like a tide. I couldn't hold it back. I needed to write to process this feeling that was coursing through me. And I began to write, and I didn't know what I was going to say or what I needed. I just knew I needed to sort of word vomit it onto a page and really express what I was feeling. And that thing that I wrote ended up becoming this long form open letter called I Need to Talk to Spiritual White Women About White Supremacy that I published, and it went super viral, and it initiated me into this public conversation around white supremacy, racism, identity, and this path that I'm on now doing this work.
Well, thank you for taking the initiation.
Yeah. And it's funny. I feel like I was initially initiated, and then I have been initiated a number of times over after that, because even with that, it was like, but I'm not one of the teachers. Go speak to one of the teachers. I'm just saying, this is how I feel. This is what I've noticed. This is what I've been learning. And the response to what I put out into the world was varied from, thank you for saying it. This is life changing. I needed this, to absolutely the hate that was in those men's eyes in email form. Mm. That was a big shock to the system. When you're one person and just so many people at the same time, that letter was read by a lot of people, hundreds of thousands of people. And to receive back a wave of that much. So many of the things that I talk about in my book, Me and White Supremacy, so white fragility, the tone policing, the centering, and anti-Blackness, right, was really, it caused a very traumatic response within me. And I remember I was like, this is part one of the letter. In a few days' time, I'm going to come back with part two. I ended up having to take quite a few months to process what was happening before I could come back with part two. And so there's been various stages along the way where I've tried to resist the work because it's hard and it's heartbreaking, and it's not something that's just cerebral or without any sort of feeling attached to it. It's about me. It's about my children. It's about people who look like me. There is this great emotional attachment to the work that cannot be separated from it. And I didn't have the tools and needed to do a lot more healing to be able to carry all of that, so that I wasn't doing this work from a place of like martyring myself to save the world, but really honoring myself and still showing up in service. And that's something that I talk about in any conversation, whether I'm talking with my husband, my best friend, whether I'm on a stage, a podcast. I just met someone. I will talk about the fact that I wouldn't be able to do the work that I do in the way that I do it without working with my mentor, Dr. Frantonia Pollins, who has been my guide and my support system and the person who's really helped me to heal myself and transform myself so that I'm able to do the work that I do in a way that is of service. But she calls it being of service versus being a servant. And what I had to learn was that there are going to be a lot of people who are going to want, who are hungry for, okay, I want to do the work. I want to know. I have these questions. Tell me everything. Being a servant is, let me pour everything of myself out onto you until I am completely depleted because I want to make the world a better place, versus let me take care of myself first. Let me learn how to pour into myself so that when I give to you, I'm giving from the overflow and not what's for me. Let me learn how to have good boundaries for myself that honor me. Let me be very clear on what my vision is and the way that I want to show up in my work. And also let me do the work of healing my own internalized white supremacy, the ways in which I do the things to myself that I'm asking people with white privilege not to do to me. The work for me goes hand in hand. As I do this public work of putting these resources and these teachings out into the world, without, on the other side, having a very strong, without doing very foundational work to support me, I wouldn't be able to do it in the way that I would do it. And you would see me burnt out, exhausted, angry. Every area of my life would look stressed out, basically. And I was there right before I started working with her. I started working with her specifically because I was burnt out. I was every day having conversations online with white people about white supremacy, and I had no way of knowing how to take care of myself. And so it was ending up with me just being super combative, very burnt out, very heartbroken. And then it was affecting me physically. I remember seeing pictures of myself from that time of my life. The light in my eyes was just gone. At home, my family life was being affected because when I'm happy in my house, everyone is happy. My husband's happy. My kids are happy. Everyone's happy. When I'm not, everyone is affected. Everyone was affected. And so I started working with her, and I just believe it's not possible for me to do the work that I do without being held by someone in that way.
I'm really pleased that you have that support for what you're doing, and because I really think it's a crazy time that we're in. It's a really wonderful time that we're in, but the internet and the nature of social media and of podcasts, it means that you have conversations or you say things. I know you talk about centering an audience, but any conversation, no matter who you're centering, is open to anyone, which is very different to a time where conversations would happen in a room, right?
Yes.
People were either in the room or they weren't in the room, and you could see who was in the room. And now we're just in a very different time where anyone can be in the room and you don't even know that they're there.
Yeah.
You don't have that natural censoring that humans have had for many years. I grew up noticing that, you can just see, like, when my parents would hang out with their Indian friends, like, there's just a different vibe to when they hang out with other friends or other communities or networks. And now we're in this place where all of it's out there, right? So that censoring or those kind of subtle differences of how one relates are there. And then that's also wildly, it holds this wild opportunity, because it also means that, for example, everyone listening to this gets to listen to two women of color having a conversation, and they might not have that opportunity to do that in their day-to-day lives. So it's kind of this amazing time. And I think for me, actually, this journey of understanding how my race really was affecting my life in terms of a global structure happened at 9/11. But I'm a younger sister, So I have an older brother. And so it happened not because of something that was happening for me. I was 19
Right.
and I was into things that I was into. But my brother, who was in his early 20s and had a very visceral reaction to 9/11 of I'm a young brown man, like his friends weren't getting stopped and searched
Right.
in the level that he was. And then of course with the London bombings and these kind of things. So he kind of went on a big journey to understand, even though our family is not Muslim, but just to understand as young Asian people, like how this affects, how this was going to affect the world. And he is now the race editor of a political magazine called Red Pepper in the UK. And that took me on a journey that I wasn't exactly ready to go on.
Mm.
It's been a sort of it's definitely been a quiet journey for me of just having to pay more attention to what I had been taught. And it's interesting, when I say taught, I don't mean that anyone ever sat me down and said, be invisible. Don't let anyone notice,
Right.
It's just that you learn, like, from a survival perspective. You see what's happening around you. You see what your parents and other immigrants are doing. You find yourself, I found myself in schools where I was one of the only people of color. And, I grew up in a school where everybody used to say, no offense, Amisha, every time they told a racist joke. And I just was sort of expected to just kind of laugh at the joke or not get upset about it because they said, no offense, Amisha, before they said it, And so you kind of I grew up in a space where it was like, well, you've been brought in, you're allowed to be here, so don't mess it up, right?
That's right. And that is exactly that is where as I came into my own awakening that I was describing, that was what I was realizing. I'm in a space and in an industry where I have recognized in the back of my mind that I'm lucky to be here, in air quotes, right? While it may be uncomfortable to be constantly navigating the fact that this space isn't made for you and you are visibly the odd one out, don't make a thing out of it. Just keep yourself neutral, palatable. It's these small ways of betraying ourselves. Very small, like micro adjustments that we make not to draw attention to our difference. Because what we don't realize, as you said, we weren't taught it. Nobody sat us down and said, you are this, 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 this. But what we are conditioned into is these things that make you different from, quote unquote, the norm are a place from which to feel a level of shame. We don't want to feel that shame. And so we're not focusing on it. And we don't want to draw the people's attention to it. Right. And so there's some things, like, I think, because I continue to do my own inner work. Right. And there's things that I remember and I'm like, wow, that's why it felt so uncomfortable in that situation, because that's how I was interpreting it. So, for example, what came up for me recently was I recall being in university and my best friend was white, and it was always just her and I, but we would sometimes hang out with her boyfriend and his friends, and they were all white. And they, I'm Muslim and I don't drink, but they played rugby. So they had a very heavy drinking culture. We would go to bars and clubs and I would just be so uncomfortable. And I would often feel like, on and off throughout those years, I covered and then I didn't cover my hair. And I would cover with like a hat if I wanted to cover. And you'd go into the bar and they'd be like, well, you can't wear hats in here. You have to take your hat off. And then I would have to explain, well, I'm actually wearing it for religious purposes. It was like a whole thing that I felt like these guys are just here to just drink and have a good time. And I'm holding things up because of this thing with my religion, right? At the time, it felt like I'm being a burden. When I look back now, I'm like, but why was that a burden? That's not a burden. That was my belief. Just because the world wasn't made for how I show up doesn't mean that I'm a burden. And another thing that I would remember, so we would get it, we would hang out with these guys and I would be surprised each time that they would remember who I was. Bear in mind, I'm the only Black Muslim girl that they know. And I'm my best friend's main best friend. So why they would not remember me, I don't know why I believe that in my mind. I believe it was because I had so minimized myself. I had so made myself non-important, an accessory to them, something that was on the side, that for them to know who I was or to recall my presence was like, oh, you do see me. And it was because I didn't see myself and because I had been conditioned, don't see yourself, you're not the main event here. And so things like that, where as I'm doing my inner work and I'm looking back and I'm like, oh, that was a way in which I turned down my light a little bit and I didn't turn it back up. It was just like constantly turning down the light lower and lower and lower and lower. And so when you turn it down lower and lower and lower, and then you realize I'm just this little spark and there's all these bright lights around me, but I'm just this tiny spark. And you realize this isn't right. I don't want to live like this. Why have I done this? What has contributed to me showing up in this way? As you begin to turn your light back up, which is to stand in who you are unapologetically, it makes you feel uncomfortable and it makes other people feel uncomfortable too.
Mm.
For me, again, just a small example. Now I'm known for like wearing very bold lipsticks. Like I have lipsticks in every color basically. And I've been spotted based on my lipstick. Like, oh, I recognize you because of the lipstick. But years ago, I wouldn't wear lipstick. I wouldn't wear bright lipstick. The reason being was I grew up and what was seen as beautiful was a Eurocentric idea of a woman. Thin lips, not big African lips. My lips are large. They're not the thin white lips that are supposed to be beautiful. If I put bright or bold lipstick on my lips, it draws even more attention to them. And then it will look, again, in air quotes, uglier than I'm already perceived to be. I remember when I first started saying, no, I'm actually going to put this bold lipstick on. And I would feel so uncomfortable. I would walk around thinking everybody's looking at me. In my mind, my lips were like 4 times the size that they actually are. It just felt very uncomfortable for me. And even though the feedback that I was getting was, wow, that color looks great on you. You look great. I wish I had the confidence to wear bright lipstick. But in my mind, I was like, this is super uncomfortable because it's going against the wiring in my brain that tells me I'm not supposed to do this. And so there's these small, like micro adjustments that we make to turn the volume down, to turn the light down as we begin to turn it back up and say, no, actually, I'm going to claim my beauty. No, actually, I'm going to claim this. I'm going to take back that. It makes us ourselves uncomfortable. And it also pushes up against how like stereotypes around how we're supposed to show up in the world.
Yeah, I had quite a different sense of myself in that when I was younger, I really I was always wearing very like bold clothes. I was very expressive. And yeah, because there was kind of like an innocence that I had.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to be seen. And I just have always been somebody that loves beautiful things and loves bright colors. And I just went out like that all the time. And in a way, it almost felt like a protection as well. And it's been interesting because it was actually later, probably even late 20s, sort of early 30s, that I started to strip everything back to not be seen so much. And I wonder as well if that has also correlated with some of the inner journeys around race, and where more and more awareness has come in. Maybe where I've just not wanted to be noticed so much. Yeah, it's not exactly easy to identify.
But I think what you're speaking to, which is really important, is that each one of us is, when I say us, I mean people of color, Black people, have our own individual stories and journeys around how this thing that we call white supremacy has impacted us in all of these various ways. We have our individual stories and journeys, and the way in which we come into our awakening and the way that we choose to walk that path is very different and individual for each one of us. It's really important for each one of us to honor what that looks like without using it as a way to compare.
Yeah, for sure.
Right? Like, oh, I didn't have that experience the way she had it, therefore my journey isn't as valid, or whatever that thing is that we do as human beings, right? For myself, I know we are all very unique, but I do know in my community of work, I know I have a very unique background coming from the cultures that I come from and the places that I've lived and the experiences that I've had. But that being said, each one of us has had very unique experiences, right? Some of us have chosen or have been called to share that journey out loud, and some of us are not. Some of us have chosen to take that on and do really what I see as very courageous activism work on the front lines, putting our bodies in the way of this thing that we call white supremacy. And some of us, like myself, prefer to write and host podcasts and speak. And some people, want to that's just their journey for themselves, and whatever that looks like for each one of us, in whichever way we are called to walk that path, it is so valid. And it's so important for us to honor what that looks like for ourselves as individuals.
For sure. And for me, I think the sharing, and it's not about comparison, but it's like, when I hear you say bits of your story, it gives me an opportunity to go back and just and see, because I think that for me, one of the most powerful aspects of becoming more aware and more expressive around how white supremacy has affected my life is that it's allowed me to go back at my life, and there were all these things that happened, all these doors that got closed or slammed, or groups that I got ostracized from, and all like people that I just made uncomfortable and then cut me out, and I didn't ever really understand why. And then I spent years thinking I must have this like epic personality like defect. And I spent all this time in therapy and going to different healers and trying to understand, like, why am I having this effect on people when I'm not like even saying anything? And then what happened for me is that as I started to talk to more people of color, because I didn't have a lot of people of color in my community, and so I didn't have other people that I could explain, I would explain this to my white friends, like, this has just happened. And they'd just be like, I don't know why this stuff keeps happening to you, because I think you have like a heart of gold. And I'd just be like, but it just keeps happening. And so this epic sense of personal like failure and then low worth because of these things that were happening. And then when I started to talk to more people of color, make friends with more people of color, they were able to help me see like, oh, this is actually quite a common experience. And then I was able to reframe some of these things that had happened to me. And of course, take ownership for where I can take responsibility, and there's something that I can shift myself, but then also this acceptance and this like, oh, okay, it's that. And there's something that's then both freeing about that. And then you're like, oh, okay, so this is where we are in the world.
Right.
So it does both. It kind of freed me on a more inner level to realize like, that there wasn't this thing that was wrong with me that I could change. And then at the same time it made me realize like, oh, okay, so then I have to accept that this is the reality of the world that we live in, and then also do my bit to unpick that and to have a kind of resilience in it.
Right. My mentor, Dr. Frantonia, she talks about having your own personal universe and then living in the collective universe, right? So in my personal universe, being a Black Muslim woman is not all the things that white supremacy says it is. I'm not inferior. I am not less than. I'm not a threat. I'm not I'm not the angry Black woman. I'm not any of those things, right? In my personal universe, in the collective universe that we live in together as people around the world, that those things are there in the paradigm. They're not true, but they're there in what we have collectively, again, quote unquote, agreed is the truth, right? Before starting this work with her, what I was not able to access was my own personal universe. I lived in the world of the collective universe and took on the world's truths as my own truths. And so I walked in the world with this sense of exactly what you said. There must be something wrong with me, right? Instead of the way the world is set up is wrong. No, there must be something wrong with me, right? And so building my own internal foundation, my own internal universe has allowed me to accept, as you said, the reality of the fact that the world believes a lie, right? Believes a lie and has set up this system of oppression, which it privileges some and takes from others. That is a lie, but it is the reality of what the world is, but it's not my reality of who I am. And I am learning to walk with both at the same time. So in my personal universe, knowing the truth of who I am, I walk as that every single day. But I also, what Dr. Frantoni calls managing your expectations, I manage my expectations that when I go into a space where, in fact, any space, when I go into any space, there is going to be stereotypes that are held about me. There are going to be expectations of me, beliefs about me that I can't control, but they're not the truth. But if I go in thinking they see me the way I see myself, then I'm setting myself up for a fall. I'm setting myself up for the heartbreak of when that racism does show up and I'm not prepared for it. Because I thought that this space was going to be different because X, Y, Z, that was really where that letter, I need to talk to spiritual white women about white supremacy, came from. I thought that we were in this work of like changing the world and doing good and being light workers and all of that. This is what I thought this was about, but racism abounds here in this space, right? My heartbreak was I thought this space was going to be different because we're all about the evolution of humanity. And yet here's this ugly thing right here. I have to be able to hold both at the same time, understanding I am who I say I am, not who the world says I am, but the world has a picture of me that I'm working through the work that I do to change, but that picture is still there. And I have to enter those spaces knowing that that is how I'm going to be perceived. And so I manage myself so that I'm not shocked by, how did this show up here? And now the heartbreak and the pain and all of that. So, but it's quite a journey to be able to do that because you're really having to rewrite. We talked about what we were taught when we were young. Really, that conditioning that happens when you're very, very young. It's like the blueprint of who we become as adults, and it really takes going layer under layer under layer under layer to really discover, why do I have this lingering sense of unworthiness and inferiority and lack? Like, where is that really coming from? And for those of us who hold marginalized identities, whether it's around race, whether it's around gender, whether it's around physical ability, whether it's around sexuality, the world is set up so that a very specific group of people can thrive. And the rest of us have to adjust ourselves. That reclamation work is peeling back each of those layers and looking at what was the seed thought, the seed belief that started this whole thing for me and how I see myself. And now, how do I rewrite that with something that is more true about what I know myself who I know myself to be? Audre Lorde has this quote that says, if I didn't define myself for myself, I would be crunched up into other people's fantasies of me. If I didn't say who I was, then who you say I am is going to be really painful for me. And I will not survive. I will live through life with a sense of brokenness, defect, unworthiness. And I will get to the end of my life not having lived the full breadth and depth of my life. And she has another quote, which I also love, which she says, again, I'm paraphrasing, nothing I accept about myself can be used against me to harm me. So when I believed that being a Black woman meant a certain thing, anytime someone would reflect that back to me, I would feel hurt because deep down I believed it. But when who I know I myself to be doesn't match up with who you're telling me I am, then it just bounces off. Right? But that is that deep reclamation work of saying everything that the collective universe says about me isn't actually true. This is who I am. This is who I choose to define myself as. And I will walk on this earth in that truth, no matter what anyone says or thinks about it.
It's incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
Holding that deep understanding so that you don't constantly get broken by the reflections that come back or the way that things happen and you're like, what? Like, that was crazy.
Yeah.
Like, one example that I can share of something that happened to me this year was I was on a podcast, and it's somebody that is very much in like the UK kind of community of embodiment and yoga and coaching and all of this kind of world. And many people I know have been on this podcast. And I wanted to talk about embodied sacred activism, which did not make it into the episode at all. Instead, he wanted to talk about how patriarchy and race were affecting him. Said things like, do you find, like, because you're like an Indian yoga teacher, that you get booked more? I was not.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, you can go and listen to this. It's on there.
Oh, wow.
And we ended up, because at the end I said that was a really like unfulfilling experience for me. So we ended up recording another half of it. And the same thing happened. And again, we get through this whole thing, and I haven't talked about this thing of embodied sacred activism, which was what I wanted to talk about.
And you've also been used basically perpetuate a system of oppression. Like my mind is blown.
But here's the thing. The thing is that I was so shocked when it was happening that I didn't say anything intelligent about it. I just somehow like tried to explain that no, in fact, I do not find that I'm constantly booked as a yoga teacher because I have brown skin. I have found that some people have come up to me and shared that they feel a certain kind of safety, but that's happened a few times. And one space where that happened that was quite profound for me was where I was teaching a class that a whole group of women of African descent started coming to. And then they came and said to me, we feel safe to let go in our bodies when you're holding the space. And that was a profound moment for me. And I was like, wow, like this is powerful. And I didn't know that I'd never been in a space where I had even allowed myself to think about how safe my body felt or not. And so that was like a whole beautiful journey. But with this podcast and this guy, I just didn't know what to do. And then of course, like we're friends, and there's like friends kind of in a kind of wider community sense. And he then said, well, we could just not publish it. And then I was like, well, that's not fair. So one, I didn't get to talk about what I want to talk about. And then two, now my episode doesn't even go out because of this. So I just said, no, let's just put it out. I don't care. I thought about calling it out. And then I just thought, I don't have the energy for this right now. So it's going to be out there, and some people aren't going to notice. And then other people are going to go, ooh, this is uncomfortable and a bit weird. And I'm going to carry on. And now it's like, I know that I have a choice about who and in what scenarios I'm willing to talk about the color of my skin, and that it's my problem. It's mine. It's like I own what conversations I'm willing to send to that.
Yeah, we had a conversation before we started this conversation that people are listening to now. And I was also interviewed recently, this time by a white woman, and I had an extensive conversation with her before we hit record as well. And that's because I need to know, where are you in this conversation? before we have this conversation. Because what I don't want is to be put in a position where I'm set up, not even from a malicious intent, right? But just from a lack of consciousness and a lack of intentionality, but where I'm set up to basically be in a position where I walk away with that feeling that you just described, right?
Yeah.
And I do that regardless of if the person is white or a person of color, because even as people of color and Black people, we have our own internalized oppression that we must work through as well. And so it's just very important for me that when I go into any space, I absolutely want to show up in service to the work. I absolutely want to make sure that people get something from it that moves them, that inspires and educates and activates them. But I also will not be put in a position where I am dishonored or where I have to betray myself, not from a conscious place, but just because I did not think about the space that I was entering into and what it would bring up. And that comes through experience, right? I had to experience again and again and again, thinking that I would be going into a place that was made for me and that would honor me, and then realizing, no, it happened again, right?
Right.
And kicking myself because I should have known better, because this isn't the first time that this has happened. Da, 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 da. And when it happens so many times, and when you go viral, you have the profound gift of it happening all, like getting many lessons in a very short period of time. And so you have to, just for survival reasons, be very clear on your boundaries, just for survival reasons. But then even moving from surviving into wanting to thrive, okay, now I want boundaries that honor me, that honor the person that I'm in conversation with. I want them to know this is what I need, this is what I want, and I want to know what they need and what they want. And can we have our conversation in a way that honors both of us? And if not, then it's not going to work for either one of us. And we can say, this isn't meant to be. Something I'm thinking about is I was recently a speaker at a conference, and I was the last speaker of the day. And so I got to listen in on some of the panels. And this is a conference that, was hosted by a Black woman. A lot of the speakers were Black women and women of color there. But also anyone was, invited to come. And some of the panelists and some of the hosts were white and other people of color. And so I was watching this panel, and what I saw unfold was, again, a lot of the things that I talk about in my work, right? I saw anti-Blackness show up. I saw white feminism show up, and I was very emotionally triggered by it. And so I chose to say something about it. And I could tell that there were other Black women in the room who were feeling similarly. And so we, as I spoke up, they also spoke up, and we began to speak up. But I said, look, I am a Black woman, and me speak, and I'm a Black woman who has written a book called Me and White Supremacy, who has done all of this work. And even me saying this thing here, I'm shaking right now as I say it, because it's hard for me, right? I don't want to be that person who's saying that thing, right? But what I'm seeing show up is very harmful. It was like, even in that space where I was like, this isn't going to show up, because this whole conference I know is hosted by someone who's very clear on making this space centered for us. She can't control everything that's happening in every room. Even there, I was like, well, you had to manage your expectations, because there were people in that room who are not doing their work. Things were showing up in the conversation that they were not able to really hear. And even when it was pointed out to them, still were not able to hear. And it was causing a lot of pain for people in the room, myself included. And it was like, well, is another refinement for you. Just because there are other people of color in the room doesn't mean that this thing isn't going to show up. Right. And so that is like this continued lesson. And I think when I see things like that play out, like, yes, it helps me to refine my foundation and my boundaries and those kind of things. But it also makes me really compassionate of the ways in which we're so, as people of color, we're so unaware of the deep, deep way in which white supremacy is ingrained in us. Right. And that's why I said before we hit record on this conversation, I said, we are two people of color, but I'm very aware, even in a conversation between two people of color, this thing can show up.
For sure. And sometimes more if the inner shame around being a person of color hasn't been worked through or addressed.
Precisely. And that's what I saw show up in this panel, was that the person hosting it was not white, but was a person who, it was clear from the way that she was responding in the conversation, a conversation around race was very uncomfortable for her.
Yeah.
Right. And so I need to know, when I go into conversations with people, how comfortable are you with the conversation around race? Because this isn't, like I said earlier, it's not a cerebral thing. It's not an intellectual thing. When you are a person of color, it's very personal. And each one of us are in different places on that journey of awakening and comfortability with being able to talk about what it means for us as individuals. Like, we can talk about, like, this is what it looks like. These are the terms. This is how it shows up for in general. But when we talk about, this is my own personal journey with this, have you been able to come to that place within yourself where you can have that honest conversation? Because if you can't have it with yourself, it's very hard to have it with other people. And sometimes we have other people who can help facilitate that conversation, that internal conversation. I think that takes someone who's done their own work and is doing their own work. But more than anything, I really think that it's important, as you were saying, sort of thinking back on your life, looking at what are the ways in which this has shown up and how do I feel about that? What does that mean for me now? What am I noticing? Do I make it smaller than it is? Do I try and bypass it spiritually? Does it make me feel like it's too much, or it's not worth going back into the past, or I just want to live in a world where none of this exists, so I'm going to pretend it doesn't exist? How am I coping with this? Whatever that looks like, I really just say to honor it, because I know for me, it showed up in all kinds of different ways. It showed up as anger, it showed up as grief, it showed up as apathy, it showed up as like wanting to close my eyes back up again and pretend this never happened. You know what I mean? I opened Pandora's box and I want to put the lid back on it, all of that. And that's, I think, the process of awakening.
Hello, this is Amisha. We are just taking a little break from the conversation here. On behalf of myself and the team, I want to say thank you for being part of creating a beautiful future. We make this for you so that we will all have the vision, wisdom, and activism we need at this time to weave a new narrative. Can you help us with this? You can do that by making a monthly donation to the podcast to cover our costs. Just the equivalent of a fair trade banana you might eat or a chai latte you might drink whilst you listen to this will make a huge difference to us. Head to www.thefutureisbeautiful.co/community to become a monthly patron. And the other thing is to tell your friends about this podcast so they can tune in too. Send them a message or post on social media and let them know what you love about it. And whilst you're at it, leave us a review. And now, back to the conversation. Thank you for your loving beauty. Yeah, I think that kind of understanding the delicacy of this work is really important, and how having conversations out loud when you're not ready, or having conversations with white people about it when you don't feel like you have enough support and resource. It's kind of walking this balance. I mean, I co-curated this gathering last year, and it was this spiritual gathering. It's a community that I'm one of the only non-white people in, and it was this bringing together of the masculine and the feminine, but it's also a big space where everyone calls in their ancestors and all of this stuff. And I'm so aware that my ancestors have a very different story, especially when we're standing on British land that...
I mean, their ancestors are mainly colonialists. So
right.
It's,
I'm on somebody's estate,
Right.
That their family got through colonialism. There's a different feeling that's happening in my system for sure. And then my presence is bringing something different into that circle.
Yeah.
That of course nobody wants to see. They just want to see like, oh, Amisha, there you are with your big eyes and your great ability to hug, and like,
Right.
and of course all of this other stuff is happening, and there was a lot of really, really, really crazy things that got triggered in that space, and I was holding so much, and it was so heavy, and I brought up, because it got twisted into the story where it was all, anything that was uncomfortable was to do with my personal story.
Of course.
Of
right.
course. So, and then I became like the crazy one. And
right.
when I tried to have a conversation with the co-facilitator on this, like it was actually a year later, and we were having a WhatsApp conversation, and I used the words white supremacy and white fragility, not as an attack, but as a like bringing them into the mix of like, maybe this isn't all about me and my personal story. And he blocked me on WhatsApp.
Yeah.
And I was like, and I just felt like I don't have enough support in my life to be having these kind of conversations with these powerful white men right now in this scenario. And that might be different at different points in my life. Recognizing that is also really important. And this thing that's often said, that if you're a white person and you're having all of these realizations about your own journey, like don't just go to your friends of color and be like, tell me what it's like to be a person of color. Acknowledging how much emotional labor is part of this journey, and that has to be done because we're talking about a collective shift, and one that's slow. And so of course more people have to do. The amount of work that people have to do is different depending on all kinds of different aspects and circumstances.
Right. I just want to acknowledge that I'm really sorry that you had that experience, because that experience is very traumatizing. And what essentially happened was that, they're using, so this method of calling in the ancestors is something that comes from brown and black cultures. And what often happens in spaces like in the yoga world, in the wellness world, and spiritual, growth world is a colonizing and appropriating of Black and brown cultural traditions, rituals, artifacts, ways of being to feel more spiritual while pushing to the margins the people who actually come from that lineage, because you are a reminder of what they are doing. Right? And so your physical presence in that room was a visual, you were a visual representation of, we know what we're doing. And we know it isn't, it's, there's something completely out of alignment here. When I was, at the panel that I was talking to you about, something that was brought up in the room as part of the sort of conversation was, well, what the question, I don't know why it was framed this way, but the question was asked like, oh, well, what tone should women use to ask for this specific thing? Something I said to her, I said, when you use the word tone, Black women, when we are seen, when we enter the room, there is already a perceived tone before we even utter a word. Right? There is a tone that is perceived that this person is going to be aggressive oftentimes, or they're going to be sassy, or they're going to be difficult in some way. Right? And so you being the only, did you say the only person of color or one of the only people of color in the room?
Yeah.
You, without even saying anything, you were not aggressing in any way. You were not saying, hey, we shouldn't be doing da 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 da. But there was already a perceived tone because of your physical presence. Right. And so what white fragility does, and white fragility is, the inability to hold the conversation around race without, doing any sort of defensive moves. What white fragility does, oftentimes it will turn things around. This is something I'm uncomfortable with, but I'm going to say it's you. This is something I'm going to be doing, but I'm going to say it's you that's doing it. And so what happens is you get gaslighted, which is what it sounds like happened to you. And so you became the source, the point, the focal point upon which this is an Amisha thing. This is not an us thing. right? And it's done in spiritual spaces, the way that it's done is so painful because again, you're expecting that the spiritual values and principles, which you all feel like you all believe are going to be the thing that rules the day. But actually what rules the day is white supremacy.
Mm. And these are the moments where the heart gets really broken because you had
Absolutely.
gathered under what felt like shared values and shared spiritual practices and a shared commitment to the healing of humanity.
And that is absolutely right. And what this speaks to is it does not, what I'm saying is not, I'm not saying that there is a there's a malicious sort of intent upon which people are operating. But what I'm saying is we really have to understand the way in which white supremacy is very, very strong. Right. One of the things that I talk about in my book is, you really have to redefine what it means to you to be a good white person. Because good isn't just how it looks, but it's actually the actions in which you take. Right. And so in that room, that the fact that nobody, it sounds like, came and stood up for you, stood with you and said, no, you know what? This isn't right that we're doing this. Or I think, Amisha has some points here that we should listen to, or something of that nature. Right. The fact that nobody showed up, that would have been the good thing to do.
Yeah. There's a few people in the community that think that, I didn't go this year to the gathering and think that I should have just come and fitted back in and all could have been forgiven and healed.
Right. You should just make yourself small again.
But my body couldn't do it. And it was super painful to not go because it was also my community, my
right.
friends,
right.
the people that I had been on a journey with for 7 years prior to this. And yet I just had this overwhelming sense that to go back in that space without these issues that were partly around patriarchy and partly around white supremacy.
Yes.
That without those being addressed, I was going to be betraying something in myself at a level that I can't even express with words.
Absolutely.
And the pain and the karma of that is stronger than being isolated.
Absolutely. And what you're speaking to is really the awakening is so painful because it really has you look and have to renegotiate everything and all of the important relationships in your life. One of the things that I talk about in the new version of Me and White Supremacy is how a friendship that I had for a number of years that we would talk on the phone every week. We were on the verge of, creating and launching a program together. She was my best friend. She's a white woman. She was my best friend though. But as I began to speak about race, she just faded into the background. She just disappeared on me. And when we had the conversation around what happened, her response to me was, well, I felt like you had support from other Black women. So why would you need me? And I'm like, but you have seen me walk through other really hard things and you've always been there for those things. Why is this an exception? Right. And what I had to understand was that she was not ready in any way to do any work around this, that my talking about this was confronting to her personally. And as much as I knew she loved me and I love her and I still love her and we ended our friendship, but I wished her all the best, and I harbor no feelings of, again, like, I just wish her good. That's all. I only wish her good. But I also know for me to remain in that relationship would have been, as you said, such a huge betrayal to myself in a way that I don't think I could recover from. And so I had to save my own life first. For all your life up until the point when you start to have this awakening, you self-betray and you self-betray and you say, it doesn't really matter. And you say, when friends say things like, no offense, Amisha, but X and X and X racist joke, it's fine. I can deal with it. It's fine. And then it comes a point where it's not fine anymore. And then you can't go back. Because to go back when you know what it actually costs for you to be in that space and be so dishonored, for you to go back and say, you know what, I'm just going to go back into that space and now be knowingly dishonored, is just the worst kind of self-betrayal. But it's so hard because then you have to release relationships and community and figure out, well, where do I go from here? So where am I safe? So who can I confide in? So where can I share these things? Something that I had to learn was, as I had my awakening and realized I'm basically surrounded by white women, I now need to go find a group of people who look like me. And I did find them. What I had to learn even in that was that a lot of those relationships were based on trauma bonding.
Mm.
And what I mean by that is there were relationships that were based on the trauma of awakening to the harm that being in relationships with white women felt like. And so we were able to bond on that pain, but we weren't necessarily bonded through values or through anything else other than pain. And I've had to release some of those relationships as I've done my, as I started working with my mentor and really started looking at, well, what's important to me? I had to release some of those relationships too. And it was like, well, if I can't be safe here, I can't be safe there. And it's like, no, I have very close relationships with a small number of incredible people who I value, who I've walked with on our journeys together, who we've poured into each other, who I want them to be in my life for a very long time. And I want to be in their lives for a very long time. And that took time to build those relationships. What's dangerous is running from one thing straight into another without doing any discernment work and without getting grounded and centered in ourselves around what kind of relationships do we actually want in our lives, right? So you run from one kind of relationship where you realize you're being dishonored and you're self-betraying to another type of relationship where you're also self-betrayal because you're building a relationship on a foundation of trauma bonding and not on how you would normally build a relationship.
Right.
In a way that is healthy. What I'm wanting people to know is that it's normal to do that. I did that, right? But what is going to be sustainable in the long term is really finding close relationships. Like, how many friends do we need? You know what I mean? Like, how many really do you need? And as I get older, I'm like, I just need a few really good friends, who really see me, who really honor me and are on their paths and I'm on my path, and we love each other and we support each other and we don't allow each other to show up in ways that are not in alignment with our values. And that's just a few good people that I need in my life who are like that.
Yeah, it's simple, but then there's also the interactions with the wider world and
Yeah.
the connections
And so I make it very clear. I'm very clear on who my friends are. When I say you are my friend, I mean something very specific versus that is an acquaintance, that is a peer, that is those are other kinds of relationships. But when I say friend, I mean something very different. And that is, it used to be a word that I would use for everyone just because I know them.
Right. Well, and Facebook also made
Instagram,
waves,
right?
with
Exactly.
everyone's your friend.
That's my friend. Oh, she's my friend. Oh, he's my friend. No. My friend are like these people that I can count on one hand. Those are my friends. Everyone else is someone I know. They are an acquaintance. They are a peer. They are, that's different. And even in those, I'm still making sure that I'm showing up in ways that honor me, regardless of what race that person is.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
I really feel the power of your journey and the depth of your journey and the integrity with which you're holding yourself. And it's, very beautiful to witness.
Thank you.
I wondered, we talked on how white supremacy is complicated and the kind of hugeness of it. And I wondered if you could explain a little bit in more detail around what it is and how it affects all of us. And then we can kind of take that into a space where, for everyone that's listening, regardless of color, like how they can begin to create a more conscious relationship with white supremacy.
Yes. So white supremacy is this very loaded term, right? When I was looking at publishing the book, Me and White Supremacy, and we were speaking to different editors from different publishing houses, I did have one editor who said, maybe we could call it like Me and White Privilege instead, because that might be essentially more palatable to people than Me and White Supremacy, because white supremacy is oftentimes this term that is associated with the most extreme right-wing, like KKK neo-Nazis, who are skinheads, who are just the worst of the worst and very violent in their racism and very blatant and very vocal in their racism, right? So the kind of images of the men that I talked about in Charlottesville. But white supremacy is actually a system of oppression that is based on the idea that those who are white or who appear as white or who are white passing are superior to and therefore deserve to dominate over those who are not. And that is very different to just relegating it to the most extreme forms of vocal violent racism, because essentially it's a system that is institutionalized, that spreads into all areas of our life, right? It's spread into all areas of our life. And the way that I talk about this work, when I'm writing this book, as I was writing this book, I'm like, this book isn't for the KKK. Like, they're not interested in having this conversation. They're very clear on what their beliefs are, right? They're very clear around how they feel about people who look like me. Who this book is for the people who say, that's not me, that's them. I'm not a part of this thing. And what I want them to be able to see as they look at all of these different areas of white supremacy, actually, I do believe that white people are superior to Black and brown people. And this is the way that I play it out in my life, right? Which is not a conscious thing, right? It's not a consciously chosen thing, but in the same way that you and I were talking about the ways in which we are conditioned to be seen as inferior and to see ourselves as inferior and to see ourselves as burden and effectively defective, the opposite of that is that white people and people with white privilege have been conditioned to see themselves as superior, as to see themselves as more worthy, as to see themselves as more valuable. And this is, I want to make really clear that we're talking specifically around white privilege, because there might be people who hear this and say, well, I grew up poor. So even though I'm white, I grew up poor, or I'm not middle class, right? And so I don't feel very privileged, right? My explanation to that is there is a difference between those two things, and your experience of what it feels like to be poor will be very different if you're not white. Right? And that anywhere you go in the world as a white person, you will immediately be perceived, before you've said anything, before you've brought anything to the table, your whiteness will be perceived as being of higher value than my Blackness. There's these different levels in which white supremacy operates. As I said, it's systemic, it's institutional. The way that I am doing this work is I can't go in, I'm not someone who's going to be working on a governmental, institutional, systemic level. But what I do, and this comes from my background around, my personal background around personal growth and development and spirituality, is I want to work with the individuals. I want to get people to really self-reflect on, how do I as an individual play this thing out? Because at the end of the day, systems and institutions are held up and maintained and sustained by people. They're not self-running, disembodied things, right? They are held up by people. And so if we can look at how we as individuals, how a white person as an individual is playing out white supremacy, they can begin to make changes in their life, which has a ripple effect on people around them, which has a ripple effect on people around them, and so on and so forth. Right. And so that's the way in which I approach this work. Like, I talk about it as a sort of, there's different prongs, there's different like ways in which you can come at this work. This is the way that I'm specifically coming at it. This is the contribution that I'm making to it. As people of color and Indigenous and Black people, we have similarly been indoctrinated and been impacted and affected by white supremacy. I really believe our primary work is to do the work of healing and self-reclamation. I think that's our primary work for ourselves, because it has taken so much away from us in ways we cannot even fathom. And again, this is why I do this work, this inner work, right alongside the outer work. Before we go out and say, this is the way I'm going to go change the world, really, we deserve to get the healing, right? We deserve to reconnect to that source inside of ourselves that is loving, that feels worthy, that feels good. And that is very revolutionary, because it's remaking the world. Mm. It's really remaking the world. It's saying the world was set up so that we would show up in these ways, but we are actually choosing to show up in the complete opposite way. And when I, as a Black woman, show up courageously, loving myself, joyful, happy, all of those great things, it is very affronting to white supremacy, right? Because because white supremacy said, that's not how you're supposed to be. We say you're this. We say you're less than human. And now you're showing up overflowing with joy, overflowing with a sense of worthiness, right? That is a buck to the system as well. So that's where I believe our primary work is. And then also for all people is to find within themselves as they're doing their inner work, is there something calling me inside that makes me want to take on or create or hold space for something even more, right? So an example that I always use is there's an African-American lady at my kid's school. My kid's school is the school that I also graduated from. And when I graduated from the school, this is here in Doha, when I graduated from the school, it's a British school, the student body is very diverse. The teaching body and the management body is very white. I graduated from the school in 2002. We're now in 2019, and it's very similar. There's a couple of like teachers of color sprinkled in, but it's a very white teaching body. And so there's an African American lady who's recently joined our school, and she is spearheading this project of diversity and inclusion in our school. Something that a year ago I brought up to the school and said to the board of governors and said, this is a problem. This is a problem. Like, why, when I was at the school, it was mainly white teachers. My kids at school, still mainly white teachers. It impacts my kids. It also impacts all kids. Because what it's telling all of the kids in the school is that the people who deserve to be in positions of authority are mainly white. When all these kids grow up, regardless of race, when they see someone in a position of authority who is not white, it's going to bring stuff up inside of them. Mm. And so things need to change. And so when I brought it up over a year ago, they were not ready for that conversation. And as much as this work is my work, that it's too close for me. My kids are in the school. It's too emotional of an issue for me to say, I will help you with this. I'm a very fierce mama bear. Like, I would get angry because I'm like, speed it up. They, were very hesitant to have a conversation. This African-American woman has come in, and she is, as part of a project that she has decided to take on. It's not part of her normal work. It's a project that she's decided to spearhead, given this proposal. And it's something that the school has said, yes, now we are ready. We're going to do this. We're going to fully support you. And so I see her as someone who has said, I see a need in this space that I'm in. I have the skills and the abilities to be able to bring change here, and I'm choosing to do this. Right? She doesn't need a platform or a best-selling book or, any of that to be able to affect real change for my children and other people's children. And all of those children will grow up into adults and go out into the world and have a different experience of themselves and the world because of the work that she is doing.
Beautiful.
in this one school. Yeah. If there is something that is calling to you to show up and start something, speak something, do something, follow those breadcrumbs. My caution, my one disclaimer, I guess I would say around that is if you're a person who is white, who holds white privilege, be very wary of slipping into white saviorism.
Can you explain what that looks like, how it comes out?
Yeah. So white saviorism is the clearest picture I can give you is white people who decide that they want to go do volunteer work in Africa, in African countries, in Asian countries, in South American countries, because they want to go help the poor Black and brown people, right? So they go into these areas completely unprepared, not knowing if their help was even needed, and believing, because they haven't done any work on their their sense of white superiority, believing that any solutions that they have to offer will immediately be the best solutions for the situation because they're coming in with a very Western and a very white sense of superiority. And so white saviorism comes from, it looks like on the outside, I'm going to go do this good thing. I'm going to go start this project. I'm going to go do this volunteer thing. I'm going to spearhead this thing. But actually, it comes from a very self-serving place of, I want to be seen as the savior. And the way that you know it's saviorism is you center your own needs, wants, and desires over what's actually needed, in the situation. So, for example, I have a friend who works in the sort of birthing world, right? She's a Black woman. She talks a lot about the Black maternal health crisis, which is both in the UK and in the US, right? Where Black women are dying at much higher rates than white women are due to pregnancy and childbirth related causes, right? And the reason why is racism, right? That's what it has found to be. It's because of racism. So many white women are often unaware of these statistics. They come into this awareness and it's like, I need to do something. Instead of thinking, where do I need to send money? Or, which organizations do I need to uplift? Or who do I go, which organizations do I go to and ask for how I can help? Sometimes white women will say, this is an issue. I'm going to start a nonprofit for this.
Right.
I'm going to start an organization for this. You're not needed in that way. There are already people who are Black and who are doing that work.
And they might need your support.
You absolutely are needed as support. You're needed financially, you're needed in other ways, right? But what you're not needed is to lead it. You're not needed to lead it. The people who are affected by it are the ones who are leading it. Right? And so white saviorism is something to be very cautious of because it comes from, as I said, this real desire to do the right thing. I want to help. I want to do the right thing. But it comes from this idea that Black and brown people are in the situation that they're in because of ourselves and not because of white supremacy. Right? So the idea of missionaries and volunteers going to Africa to volunteer to help the poor Africans. Why? First of all, this whole idea of poor Africans and the continent of Africa being basically an entire continent of just poverty is a misconception in and of itself, right? But also the things that are showing up in African countries. Why? Colonialism. Right. And so without an understanding of the ways in which colonialism and white supremacy has affected these countries, you're coming in as someone who's the beneficiary of white supremacy to save when you are the beneficiary of the system and you are bringing in all of those beliefs and all of those paradigms into the space. You're going to do more harm than good. I would say if you hold white privilege, yes, you absolutely are needed. And there absolutely will be ways in which you'll want to use your creativity and your passions and your skills to show up, but be wary of trying to lead. It's like using the example of, when we talk about patriarchy and misogyny and sexism, and then we have men coming into an awareness of the ways in which they're the ones marginalizing women, right? For them to then say, well, I'm going to go lead this initiative for women. You're not needed to lead it. Women have been leading it, right? Your job is to show up and say, where do you need me?
To close this conversation, I wondered, what is it that you want all of us, no matter what color skin we have, if we could just understand something super quickly, and we know that that's completely unrealistic because the path is, the systems are so complex, the history is so complex, and even the way that our society is organized now is so complex. But there's a huge amount of complexity in understanding this issue, no matter what body you are standing in. I guess I'm kind of wondering, like, what is the overall inner shift that needs to happen? And this could be in terms of a more spiritual level, almost as a marker that everything else guides each individual towards.
The work that I do is I write this in the introduction to Me and White Supremacy. It's not fun work. It's very heartbreaking. You're going to be really pissed off with me as you do this work. You're going to wish you never opened this book, right? Like, I'm not selling it at all, because I can't sugarcoat it, right? It is what it is. But I need for myself, as I was going through the journey of being publicly initiated into this conversation and then finding myself at this point of exhaustion. And, something that I didn't mention was that point of exhaustion wasn't just physical exhaustion, but it was also a kind of like existential crisis. Like it was, is this it then? Like, is this is the world? This is it? And, this understanding that, these conversations, like, I'm just new to this conversation. Like this work has been going on for so long, and look how little things have changed. Like, I quoted Audre Lorde twice during this conversation. It's because I adore her. Her book, Sister Outsider, is something that I consider a sort of personal sacred text. One of the reasons why is that when I would read it, I would be able to find the words for things that I was experiencing. Right? Things that she wrote about decades ago, I can read it today and say, I just literally just experienced that. And that was very affirming for me, but it was also very heartbreaking. Because if all this work has been done, and yet even today, I can say, I know exactly what Audre Lorde is talking about. I just experienced that. And something is not right. Like, things are not changing. And so being in that place and coming to that realization was very heartbreaking for me, and really put me in a place of like, what am I supposed to do with this? This is a nightmare. This is a living nightmare. Where do I gain a sense of hope, or how do I move forward sustainably, not from a place of constant visceral anger and grief? It's something that I speak about often. In addition to Audre Lorde, one of the other most influential writers for me is Octavia Butler. And that's because during that period when I took some, time for myself and was really trying to sort out for myself, what do I do? How do I figure this out? I read 2 books, which are from her parable series. So the parable of the sower and the parable of the talents. And I won't spoil it for anyone, but I just want to give a very brief overview of what the book is, and I will link it to exactly what you've just talked about, right? So the parable series lays out the experiences of the life of a protagonist who is a Black woman. She starts as a young Black girl at the beginning of the book, and by the second book, she is now an old woman by the end of the second book. She's a young Black girl who lives in a dystopian time where basically the whole world has erupted, like socially. There's no physical safety, there's no physical security, systems of governance and sort of how we're supposed to behave as human beings with one another have just been destroyed, right? And she is living in a very dark time, and in a time where it really just is about survival. But she, from a very young age, starts to receive downloads of what are essentially what she feels are essential truths, divine downloads. She begins to sort of record them in a book that she called Earth Seed, the Book of the Living. I actually bookend Me and White Supremacy with two of these parables, or two of these sayings from the book. So at the beginning of the book, I have one. At the end of the book, I have another. She really believes from these downloads that she gets that despite what she's seeing in the world around her, despite what the physical world is showing her, that there is an evolution of humanity that she is here to help bring into manifestation and fruition. Everyone around her is basically just in survival mode, but she is driven throughout the whole entire series by this mission, which she says is to take root among the stars. And what she means by that is that she believes that human beings were supposed to physically leave the earth and go out and find other worlds and evolve as human beings and find ourselves as something more than just beings who lived on this planet Earth. And everyone around her is like, what are you talking about? Like, we're not leaving this planet. We don't know how to go live anywhere else. And also, we just need to focus on survival right now. And she's driven throughout it and throughout the book. And again, I won't spoil it, but there are a lot of really horrible hardships that she and the people that she loves go through. And yet she stays sustained in this vision. And it's like this vision and this work and this community which she begins to foster, and this essentially this spiritual text, this religion essentially that she leads, drives her despite everything else that she sees, and is something that's greater than her. Is something that's greater than her fleeting feelings or her existential crises or even the real pain that she's seeing in the world. This thing is greater than her. And reading that book was a real turning point for me personally, because it gave me a model of, first of all, a Black woman living in a dystopian time of systems of oppression and having something greater that's leading her, that she knew I might not live to see what this new world that I've held in my mind from a very young age. I might not live to see what that looks like, but it is my job to spend my entire life preparing myself and preparing humanity in any way that I can for that new world. That was a huge turning point for me. It kind of turned the lights back on for me. And I talk about it in this idea of being a good ancestor. Being a good ancestor to me is about leaving the world in a better place than I have found it, and having something greater than the pain pulling me forward. If we're just stuck in the pain of this is what white supremacy does, this is the violence of it, this is how it oppresses, this is how it feels, this is how it makes me feel angry and sad and all of these things. Yes, like we need to honor those feelings. They're absolutely real. But I just found for me, it wasn't sustainable in moving me forward to do something about it. I needed something, I needed an ideal, a spiritual ideal, a greater than me ideal to continue to pull me forward. That every day I wake up now, I don't wake up with, gotta go face white supremacy again, right?
I have to say, on the days that one does do that, it's not a good day.
It's not a good day. It's not a good day, right? I wake up with, I have this vision for the evolution of humanity and changing the world. And it is my job to show up every single day in service to that in the way that I'm here to do it. Whatever that wording is for you, I talk about it being a good ancestor, and I have this very strong visceral connection to the story that I just shared, Octavia Butler's work. Whatever that is for you, there is something higher, bigger than us. White supremacy is something that is not of the divine. It is not spiritual. It is not the truth of our humanity. There must be some greater force, love, in whatever way that shows up for you or whatever it means to you, that pulls you forward to keep showing up every single day in this work that is absolutely 100% heartbreaking, but it's also heart expanding. It's also heart expanding because I've been doing personal growth work since like my early 20s, but I have seen the biggest healing, personal healing, and the biggest transformation in these last couple of years, where I've really done the work around my internalized depression and unleashed and been able to tap into greater levels of joy and worthiness and self-love than I've ever felt in my whole life. And I could not have done that without dancing this dance with white supremacy.
It's beautiful. I love the invitation of where the freedom in this journey lies, and that is an embodied freedom. Yes, it will be painful and heartbreaking, but it expands, and we are expanding something in the world that is calling out for that expanse. And so tapping into that stream, into that current.
Absolutely. And holding both, like I really want to make it clear, spiritual bypassing does not work, right? Using spiritual principles to skip over the trudging through the mud and the grime and the muck.
Yeah.
Using we are all one race, the human race, to skip
I don't
over
see race or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't see right. Skipping over the realities of the world that we live in our collective universe, as I talked about earlier, doesn't work. It doesn't work. What works, but it's hard and not many are willing to do it because of how hard it is to really sit and do work such as Me and White Supremacy, where you look at how does this show up for me? How have I dishonored myself and dishonored other people by showing up in ways of superiority and making others inferior? When you can sit with that and look and have that gut punch moment, right? And really be with the truth of it and recognize this is true. I have done this. I believe this. I'm absolutely conditioned in this. And now I can do the work to undo that. And in doing the work to undo that, to heal that, to change that, you reconnect with a whole other part of your humanity, and you also show up with humanity to other people. And so we do get this expanded way of being in the world, but we first have to go through the gut punch.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Really appreciate this conversation. We will post links to everything that has been mentioned, but your Instagram is Layla Saad?
Layla F. Saad, yeah.
Layla F. Saad, yeah. And your website is?
LaylaFsaad.com.
Awesome. Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amisha.
Thank you for spending your precious time with us. As always, you can find links to everything we mentioned in this episode, download our book, and discover so much more over on the blog. We don't believe in selling you things you don't need through this podcast, and so it's made possible with you, our community. If you loved this and would like to fund our show with a monthly donation or join our online group to connect with other listeners, please visit www.thefutureisbeautiful.co and click on Community and Support. Please also share with friends, hit subscribe, and leave us a review so we can grow. Those gold stars really help others find us, so these ideas can spread. Here is to us, creating a beautiful future together. The Future is Beautiful is made by an all-female team working voluntarily or on reduced rates until our listener support grows. If you have been moved by anything you heard here, please donate the equivalent of buying us a drink. All donations make a huge difference to us and will allow us to keep doing this and remain advertising free. Until next time, I leave you with this question: how will you create beauty in the world?